Well, we have online now Senator Kerrynne Liddle. Thank you very much, Senator, for appearing on Radio Taylor Adelaide about this very topical and very important issue of the referendum on the voice to Parliament.
You're welcome.
Now, so you're Senator for South Australia. And let's start with a question that just came to me overnight because I was exchanging messages with a friend of mine in Israel, an Israeli. So we have a war in the Middle East on land rights, self-determination, and we have a war in Ukraine over, I guess, sovereignty, self-determination. So why in Australia should we be afraid of an advisory body?
Well, I think I'll start with saying that all Australians, I don't think I've met an Australian who doesn't want to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples, and I don't think I've met an Australian who didn't want to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, but not in this way is what people are saying, because this proposition that is being put to the people is about two separate concepts. One is constitutional recognition and the other one is referred to as a body called Voice. Now, the Prime Minister has told us that that's an advisory body, and we've also heard it referred to as a committee. The difference between this advisory body and any other advisory body that exists, and they do exist now, and they exist to improve advice, not just to the government, but to state and territory governments around improving health, education, housing, all of those issues that people need support with when they need support. The only thing that's different about this one is it's being asked to insert it in the Australian Constitution, our nation's rule book. And to do that would be to embed something different for a particular group of people forever. I just want to say that I am an Indigenous Australian by both parents, and I've lived in an area which would be defined as regional as well as remote. And my decision about this is informed by not just lived experience, but my professional experience in working to get Indigenous people and disadvantaged people into employment, and my concern for what words mean for our Constitution, because words do matter in our Constitution.
Yes, okay, so and it's good. I was going to point out that you have an Indigenous background. I didn't realise it was on both sides of your family. So how does this, or how does the Australian institutional setup compare to other countries that also have important Indigenous populations? I use the word important, substantial Indigenous presences, like New Zealand, Nordic countries, Southeast Asia.
Well, one of those countries that you mentioned, including other countries like the United States and Canada, they refer to treaties in their countries. They don't refer to voice. And my objection is voice is not properly defined. We are being asked a question to make a decision about voice, and we are told again that this is actually an advisory body or a committee, and yet those words do not exist. The words committee or advisory body do not exist either in the question, the single question that people are being asked, or in the words of the chapter that we are being asked to change in the Constitution. And as I keep saying, words do matter, and they particularly matter in the legal context, and anything that appears in the Constitution is given consideration by the High Court, the highest court in our land. So that's why I have concern. I've sat in a committee, I've heard a number of experienced eminent lawyers in constitutional law argue differently about the words in the proposed for the Constitution. But the issue that troubles me about hearing that evidence is they couldn't agree, they're lawyers often don't agree, but there was no appetite whatsoever from the Albanese government to amend those words to reduce any risk that was raised, because there was no disagreement about a risk, it was just the quantifiability of that risk. And the risk comes from the insertion of words such as representation. What does that truly mean? What does matters mean? Well, that we've had a lot of argument about That could mean anything from parking tickets to submarines. Matters can be very broad. There's also the question of, okay, so what if the High Court is asked to consider whether there's been sufficient regard to that representation? These are really significant questions that actually have nothing really to do with the question of improving the lives of Indigenous peoples or constitutional recognition. They are about the impact on our constitution. And that gives me cause for concern. The other thing I want to raise is there's a lot of claims about this will improve the lives of Indigenous Australians, but there's not been a lot of information about the how. I've seen even this afternoon more commentary that relates to this is just the right thing to do. This is about being on the right side of history. Well, when you're making such bold claims and you're taking to the Australian people, remember we've only got a few days left before we go to referendum if people haven't voted already in pre-poll. I'm still getting asked by people stopped in the street and saying, what is this all about? And that is a problem, that we've been asked to go to a referendum without a constitutional convention, which is normally what happens. So the Australian public gets to contribute to discussion about the Australian Constitution. It belongs to everybody, and I believe it belongs to everybody equally, regardless of when you came here or whether you can trace your ancestry like mine back to the Central Desert thousands of years ago. That's the issue that I have with this. The Constitution belongs to all Australians equally. The Prime Minister could have legislated this voice, and I believe if he had done that, this probably would have got through. But the fact that he has decided to throw those two things together without giving the detail, because he's told us, don't worry about it, the detail will come later. Well, it's the Australian Constitution. It matters, and Australians know it matters because they've been very hesitant since the first Constitution in 1901 to make any changes to it. It's a very high bar to change the Constitution. It's not like an election where you elect a party and then 3 years, 4 years later, you might get bored of them and say, look, I think I'll do something else. I like somebody else's policies. When you put something in the Constitution, because of the high bar that it takes, a majority of people in the majority of states have to agree to the proposition. You need to give them good information because it is forever. It is unlikely to be removed because of the high bar.
But the question would be the Parliament that would regulate the voice and decide powers. So that would not be a way for the people through the elected representatives to fashion it. So you could be in government in a couple of years' time.
So there's two things I'd like to raise about the way this has been done. This is the most divisive way I think we could have held this referendum. Aboriginal people don't agree about this proposition. There hasn't been sufficient consultation with them, and yet we've gone to ask the majority of the non-Indigenous population what they think about a proposal that will significantly affect us forever as Indigenous peoples. I have a problem with that. I also have a problem with the reference to the legislation. That's the argument that's put up, nothing to see here, we can change this at any time. But I go back to the words. What matters are the words in the whole chapter that are proposed for the Constitution. The High Court determines anything that refers to the Constitution, not the Parliament, the High Court. So by actually putting this in the Constitution, the impact of the words has everything to do with the High Court, because the High Court considers matters in the Constitution. The Parliament decides stuff that happens in the Parliament, and the High Court on constitutional matters trumps legislation every single time.
Yeah, so that's a point that was raised, I think, a few days ago in a letter, open letter by 71 law academics across Australia, and maybe it's also reflected in what the Law Council had considered a few weeks ago. And these law academics, law professors, reached the conclusion that it was constitutionally safe.
Well,
you don't accept that. Okay.
Well, I don't accept that because we didn't hear that in the evidence given as part of the parliamentary inquiries. We had mixed views about that. In fact, former High Court Judge Ian Callanan said it opens up a legal can of worms. You'd be a brave person to say he's not a learned person in this profession in the High Court itself. It is true that other people who are associated with the High Court disagreed with that. But my point is there was no willingness or compromise to reduce the risk that there was from these words that was raised. Some of these people who raised, who gave representation were actually involved in the discussions about those words. So, I think it's fair to say lawyers never agree, but on the Australian Constitution, we should take a very cautious approach, and Australians have historically done that. I believe only 8 of 44 questions in the life of the Constitution have actually been able to be progressed through a yes vote.
Yes, and I think the design was such that having each of the states, the majority of states to support it was a conservative design element. I think that was
and for very good reason.
Yes, yeah. I guess I don't know. It's probably is to defend the states, so that maybe a larger state doesn't overrule what is considered pregnant in the smaller states.
Can I just say too that the Australian Constitution, we talk about that, and some people may not have actually understood what that actually is. The Australian Constitution is the foundation document. It mentions things like the Australian Parliament, how the Senate works, how the House of Representatives works, how the states and territories interact with the Australian Parliament. The Governor-General, it talks about finance and trade. It talks about rules associated with the judiciary itself, the legal system itself, and the Parliament. So these are the kind of issues that are contained in the Australian Constitution. And that's why I go back to, it does really matter what those words mean. I'm not a lawyer, but I sat there and I listened very carefully to a great deal of evidence that was provided. And as I said, I heard the concerns. There's Marcia Langton, a professor, wrote with Tom Calmer, another Indigenous professor, I think it's about a 273-page report about voice, right? They were exploring a whole range of ideas. I asked her in that joint parliamentary committee about the working group that informed that report that said, and I know this quote off by heart, non-justiciability of voice should be a feature of its design. That's what that group said. When I asked Professor Langton whether she agreed with that, she said she felt duty-bound to sign off on that document, even though it was not her personal view. Now, these are in transcripts. You can go to Hansard if you see fit to go and chase up the actual evidence. So I immediately go to, so what else are they not telling us about what was written, what was said, that they don't actually agree with? I think there are serious questions about some of the information we've provided, and Australians are coming and asking those questions. I don't know. I'm unsure. Even last night, I heard an interview with the minister where she was talking about the voice itself. Now, there's still confusion about whether this is an elected body or people will be nominated to it. Now, that may not be of concern to some people, but when you're going to go to a referendum and the outcome of this will be supposedly likely forever if it was successful, I want to know, certainly as an Indigenous Australian, which is it? And that's why I say, if you don't know, vote now, no, because it locks us into this forever. And the inconsistency in the detail seems an essential feature of design. We've been told, just wait until after the referendum, after you voted. You wouldn't buy a car and do the same thing. You wouldn't say, just give me a car. What sort of car? Oh, you don't need to know that. How far should it go? Don't need to know that. I think people will need to be careful about making this much more complicated than it needs to be. And that's why I go back to the simple. You're being asked to vote on something that locks Indigenous Australians and Australians into something forever. And if you don't know how this is going to work, how can you possibly vote for it?
Yes. Now, in a couple of answers ago, you mentioned that in New Zealand and the United States, they use the word treaties. They have treaties between the Indigenous people and I don't know who the other party would be, in fact, the sitting government. I'm not sure. What's your view on how that works, and would you be in favour of that? Because I know there are several people proposing, Indigenous people proposing no, who would say, let's have a treaty first and then maybe a voice.
Well, there are a range of views on this, but what the Prime Minister has said repeatedly, although there appears some confusion about this, is that this is about voice. Although we've seen pictures of him jumping around
I understand that. I'm asking about what's your opinion of a treaty, just as separate from the referendum?
Well, we don't have a treaty in this country, and the proposition that's come from the small group of people that went to Uluru, remembering there was a couple of hundred people that went to that meeting, but there are nearly 900,000 Indigenous Australians. Treaty is something that is apparently not part of this process. So I'm focused on getting through this because it is about voice apparently, not about treaty. And treaty, according to the Prime Minister, is not connected to this referendum on voice. That's what he said.
Yeah, I understand that. What's your view on the treaty? It exists in New Zealand and the United States, maybe in Canada, I'm not sure right now. Is that something that you think could be worthwhile in the future? I
think that's a conversation that should be had with Indigenous Australians, but there are some that obviously want a treaty. We heard Lydia Thorpe the other day saying treaty should come after truth-telling, because truth-telling is really important. So I think there are a range of views, but I go back to, at the moment, what we're dealing with is voice within our Constitution. The Prime Minister is telling us this is not a conversation about treaty.
Okay, so maybe in that view, truth-telling, treaty, maybe voice. So I think, yes, there are various flavours of no. Cool. I was going to ask you then, you've already given us a little bit about your Indigenous background. You said Central Desert. Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about that background of yours? Because we have spoken in the past of a lady who was part of the Stolen Generation and actually married into an Italian family. So now we have several Italian Indigenous people, and I like to use that to bring the culture into and to maybe mediate it through the intercultural experience.
Well, both my parents are Indigenous Australians. That's their identity, that's their language, but we have a mixed history somewhere in our background. And, they're obviously with the name Liddle. It's some British or rather Scottish ancestry that is in there. But I was born and raised on Aranda country in Central Australia. I was lucky enough to grow up with culture, country and language. And that was lucky and a privilege to have that. I've spent time in remote communities. I haven't just flown in for a day or so and driven out again. And I haven't just flown in for a quick meeting and out again. I've taken my swag out there and camped out there out in the bush on homelands for some time doing threatened species work. I've had immediate family members that have lived for very lengthy times out in those remote places. So this isn't me coming from Adelaide City and having a view about how I think this might have an impact on people living in remote and regional areas, because that's where I come from. But I've been living in South Australia now for well over 30 years. And for anybody that lives in Alice Springs, they know Adelaide is just down the road. And in true multicultural history of Australia, my husband is an Italian man. You know, I've got to say, people forget about the incredible history in this country that is a migrant history. You know, the Cameleers that came in from Afghan to build the railways, the Italians that came in, you know, and were here during wartime, and at that time, many of them became prisoners of war, but they were working on pastoral properties. You know, they've contributed incredibly to the agricultural sector, the mining sector. The Chinese community has done exactly the same. This is an incredibly rich country and a multicultural country. It has been for many years. The Aboriginal people, going back thousands of years, traded with Macassan fishermen. We have a very rich history of multiculturalism in this country. Sure, we've got some work to do. And you know what? In this past, we've made some mistakes. My own mother was a product of what's called the stolen generation. She was taken away specifically under the policies of the day, because her skin was lighter, and there was what was called an assimilation policy. So these are not unfamiliar experiences for me or my family growing up, but I still hold the position that I don't believe this proposition presented in this way, or the model that's presented in this way, is the actual thing that's going to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. I just want to give you an example. Not every Indigenous Australian is disadvantaged. It's like any other race or culture of people. Not everybody's experience is exactly the same. One of the things that I think is a really good indicator of that, even in South Australia, you know, 50.8% of Indigenous Australians are in the labour force, and something like 27% of them are actually in management and leader positions. There's what's called an Indigenous procurement policy, which was started to try and increase, and I was on the board of Indigenous Business Australia, to try and increase the amount of work that was available through government procurement for Indigenous businesses. And that's now worth over $1 billion a year. You know, their revenue of those listed companies with the supply nation increases by something like 12% every year. I mean, that's extraordinary. And when you've got an Indigenous business, it's like Italian businesses, right? For some reason, there's lots of Italians working in Italian businesses. It's the same for these businesses that are about Aboriginal products, or even people who are Indigenous people that don't have very much to do with Indigenous people in front of their business, as part of their business. These are fantastic things that people are participating in. The gap that's the widest is the gap between those people that are doing well and those people doing it the hardest. And what troubles me the most is that while we've had a cost of living crisis, when people are even struggling to put food on the table, fuel this week, I think in South Australia, you fill up your car, you're looking at over $100 for a little car. Whereas you imagine living in a remote community and trying to drive 500 kilometres from the APY lands to Alice Springs, or the APY lands to Adelaide, the horrendous cost of doing that. And at this time, the Prime Minister is focused on voice. These people don't need our parliamentarians to be distracted by this. They need us to get on with fixing those issues that are priorities for people.
And in fact, there was an Indigenous Entrepreneurs Expo just a few days ago at the Wavell Showgrounds. But wonderful. I think we're running out of time now. Thank Senator Liddle for having come on to this program. It's very interesting points, and maybe we can pursue some further. In particular, I want to pursue the Italian Indigenous interaction.
So an incredible story.